4 centuries. That's how long the African transatlantic slave trade lasted. It remains one of the darkest and most profound tragedies in human history, a story of exploitation, resilience, and the enduring human spirit. It all began in the mid-15th century when Portuguese explorers arrived on the West African coast. Initially, they traded gold, ivory, and spices, but soon their focus shifted. They saw potential in a darker trade, human lives. Europe needed labor. After the so-called discovery of the Americas, European colonists demanded workers to cultivate crops like sugar, tobacco, and cotton. Native populations, decimated by disease and brutal exploitation, couldn't meet the demand. The answer? Africa. Millions of Africans were forcibly captured, sold, and shipped across the Atlantic to fuel this growing demand for labor. Thus began the transatlantic slave trade. In Africa, the process was violent and devastating. Entire villages were attacked in slave raids. Rival African rulers, under pressure from European traders, participated in the trade by capturing prisoners of war or enemies from neighboring communities. Captured individuals were marched, often for weeks, to the coast. These forced marches were grueling, with many dying along the way from exhaustion, malnutrition, or abuse. At the coast, they were imprisoned in forts like Elmina Castle in Ghana and Gorée Island in Senegal. These forts became symbols of unimaginable suffering. Men, women, and children were packed into dark, filthy dungeons awaiting shipment. Disease, starvation, and despair claimed countless lives even before the journey began. The Middle Passage, the journey across the Atlantic Ocean, was the most infamous part of the trade. Packed into the holds of ships, enslaved Africans were chained together, often lying in their own filth, unable to move for weeks. The conditions were nightmarish. Disease, including dysentery and smallpox, spread rapidly. Food was scarce, and malnutrition was rampant. Abuse by the crew was common, including sexual violence against women. To resist, some enslaved Africans staged mutinies on board, attacking their captors despite overwhelming odds. Others chose suicide, jumping overboard into the ocean rather than endure their fate. Historians estimate that up to 2 million Africans died during the Middle Passage alone. Upon arrival in the Americas, the survivors faced unimaginable cruelty. Enslaved Africans were brought to auction blocks where families were separated and individuals were sold to the highest bidder. On plantations, enslaved individuals worked from sunrise to sunset, harvesting crops like sugar, tobacco, and cotton under the lash of brutal overseers. Punishments for disobedience were severe: whippings, mutilation, or even death. But even in the darkest of times, they found ways to resist. Some escaped, forming maroon communities in remote regions like the Palanques of Colombia and the Quilombos of Brazil. Others preserved their heritage through music, religion, and storytelling, ensuring that their cultures could not be erased. By the 18th century, resistance to slavery began to grow, both among enslaved Africans and within European societies. Revolts like the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, led by figures such as Toussaint Louverture, proved that freedom could be won. At the same time, abolitionist movements gained momentum in Europe and the Americas. Religious groups like the Quakers and individuals like Olaudah Equiano, a former slave who documented his experiences, exposed the horrors of the trade. In 1707, Britain became the first major power to abolish the transatlantic slave trade. This was followed by the United States in 1808. However, these laws didn't end slavery itself, and illegal trading persisted for decades. After abolishing the trade, Britain and other countries began patrolling the African coasts to intercept illegal slave ships. However, the trade's end wasn't immediate. Some countries continued importing enslaved Africans until 1850, and slavery itself wasn't abolished until 1888. The last country to do so was Brazil. The transatlantic slave trade left a devastating legacy. Africa lost millions of its people, leading to social and economic disruption that still affects the continent today. The Americas, meanwhile, prospered from the wealth generated by enslaved labor, but at an immense human cost. The descendants of enslaved Africans have endured centuries of systemic racism, discrimination, and inequality. Yet they've also created vibrant cultures, from the Harlem Renaissance to the Afro-Brazilian traditions of candomblé and capoeira. Their resilience and contributions continue to shape the world today. The African transatlantic slave trade was a crime against humanity, but it is also a story of strength and survival. By remembering this history, we honor those who suffered and those who resisted, because their stories must never be forgotten.